we will go ahead and get started. So good afternoon, most of the country. Good morning to some. I am Sierra Royster. I'm the Director of Innovation in APRIL, which is the Associations of Programs for Rural Independent Living. Today, we are doing a webinar on guardianship. What are the alternatives and what role does IL or independent living play? We first off want to thank our sponsors for this presentation today. With the Ford Foundation, we're able to hold some extra trainings throughout the year. So we thank them for that. A couple of housekeeping items before we get started. First, you can, depending on what type of device you are on, you can scroll over the menu bar that might pop from the top or the bottom of your screen. And that is where you'll be able to find the closed captioning for today's session. You can view the captioning by selecting the CC tab on the menu bar. For sign language interpreting, you can find the interpreter right on the screen. If you would like to change the size of the screen, if slides are shown later on, you can select the line in the middle of the screen to make the interpreter or the slides smaller or larger. If you have technical issues, please use the chat feature. You can find the word bubble in that same menu bar. If you would like to turn the chat feature off, if you are using a screener, you can do that by pressing Alt-H. For Q&A times, please note that the Q&A box is on the menu bar. Please only submit questions there as they may get lost in the chat. To ask a question or make a comment, you can also select the hand option on the menu bar, and that allows us to know you have a question. For those of you on the phone today or using keystrokes, we ask that you press *9 or Alt-Y on your keypad to raise your hand. We will then let you know you can unmute. And you can select the unmute option or Alt-A if using keystrokes. Remember, if you join into the conversation, please just try to keep background noise down as much as possible to just help us clearly hear you. Thank you for joining us today. If you need any assistance today, please message me. I'm Sierra, and I'll drop my email into the chat as well, but it's sroyster, so SROYSTER at April, APRIL -rural, RURAL.org. And now for today, I'm going to turn it over to Karen and Ron. They're going to talk a little bit about themselves. And so I'm going to skip their bios and let them jump right into the meat of the presentation. So thanks, Karen and Ron.
Thank you, Sierra. It's a bittersweet feeling, I think, for both Ron and I to be here today. We are appreciative of this opportunity to talk about guardianships, kind of a plague that's impacting persons with disabilities across the country. And at the same time, it is a sad thing that we have to have this conversation. So yes, I'm Karen Koch, and I serve as the advocacy coordinator at the Roads to Freedom Center for Independent Living. We are located in central Pennsylvania, serving as much as 1/2 of the state with nursing home transition. I am a 50-some-year-old Caucasian woman with white hair, wearing a blue and white blouse, and I use the pronoun she, her, and hers. My associate, Ron, if you would like to introduce yourself, sir.
Yeah, I'm an old person. I just celebrated my birthday last week, and I'm white male, and I use he, him, and his, and really glad that everybody's here and we're having an opportunity to talk, and I'll introduce my background a little bit later.
Yes. So Sierra, if you're ready to start the slides.
Yeah, let me pull those up really quick.
All right, thank you so much. And Sierra, if you could advance that to the next slide, please. Yes, folks, so what you see on the screen today is a message. It is a message in red ink that says, "Please don't murder me." And this is a page from a journal that a gentleman named David Italiano had shared with the Center for Independent Living here at Roads to Freedom. So what I'd like to do is just kind of tell everybody the story of David. David was a 69-year-old man who in January of 2020 reached out to Roads to Freedom. He had heard that Roads to Freedom assisted people that were in long-term care facilities. I don't like using the term nursing home because there's nothing home-ish about them. But David was in a long-term care facility here in Lycoming County, And he had met some other residents at this facility who told David, hey, we're working with this place called Roads to Freedom, and they help people get out of long-term care facilities. So David, in January of 2020, called our agency and he spoke with our intake specialist and explained that he was here in Lycoming County at a facility called Aristocare, and that he really wasn't sure why he was there, that he owned a home in Huntington County, Pennsylvania. That was about over 2 hours from where David had come from to get to Lycoming County. David owned a home and he really wanted to go back to his home. He was very confused as to why he was there. So our initial process, of course, is to share a release of information with that person who's seeking our services. So our intake staff, explained to him that they would email a release of information. David provided the name of his social worker. Staff contacted the facility, got an email address, and in January of 2020 sent a release of information for David to complete. And we didn't hear back from David for probably about 3-4 weeks. And we again got a call from Dave, and Dave indicated he was still waiting for this release of information so that we could begin providing him services. This went on for about the first 6 months. We would send a copy to the facility. David said he was never shown the document. We would fax a copy to the facility. We had snail mailed it. So it was provided to the facility in 3 alternate ways, yet they never received it. So as the advocacy coordinator, I was contacted in June of 2020, and the intake staff said, look, there's just something horribly wrong here. This man calls us, we're sending information, he's not getting this information. So I reached out to the facility in June and asked to speak to Mr. Italiano. I was told that I could not speak to Mr. Italiano, that all communication regarding him needed to go through the facility administrator, a woman named Bobby Jo Thompson. So I called and left several voice messages for Ms. Thompson, asked that she called me back, explained that one of the residents at the facility was interested in transitioning. And in order to begin this process, we needed to share documents. After a few weeks, got a phone call from Ms. Thompson. Ms. Thompson was not very kind. Ms. Thompson explained that she is the one making decisions there with David, and that if we want to have any contact with David, we needed to contact his guardian. Now, we had already been in touch with David's guardian. David's guardian at this time was a gentleman named Mr. Jim Malee. Jim had explained to us, as David did, when we asked Dave, how did you end up in Lycoming County? Tell us your story. So David explained that he had been injured by his wife. There had been an investigation, Adult Protective Services was called, and David ended up having a same-day surgical procedure at Hershey Medical Center. And Dave explained that when he came out of recovery and he was getting ready to be discharged from the facility, he was handed a telephone, and on the phone was a woman, Mary Beth Swan. Miss Swan introduced herself as a staff from the Area Agency on Aging from Huntington County. And she explained to David that, David, we need to protect you. We need to protect you from a family member who has abused you. So therefore, we're removing you from your home, and we're going to send you over 2 hours away to live in a long-term care facility. So it was very, very odd to us that Dave had to go so far. But anyway, we reach out to the guardian at the time, and Mr. Malee, when we explained who we were and what services we provided to folks, he was very excited about this. His words were, I've wondered for quite some time why Mr. Italiano is in this facility to begin with. And Mr. Malee had also shared with us that the facility was questioning David's need to be there. David was very independent. He needed no physical assistance to complete activities of daily living. He was mobile. He had minimal health concerns. He took a multivitamin and a medication for blood pressure, and that was it. So we finally get Mr. Malee to reach out to the facility, and Mr. Malee explains that he has signed the release of information to allow us to talk about getting services to David. Mr. Malee was so concerned about David's placement being incorrect there that Mr. Malee petitioned the Huntington County Court. He petitioned for Judge George Zanuck to review David's status as a person deemed incompetent and did not feel that this was correct. Mr. Malee went to the extent to reach out to an independent consultant to have a new neuropsychological evaluation performed. So in May of 2020, this evaluation was performed, and the results of the evaluation indicated that David did not need to have a guardian, that Dr. Tulak felt that David was competent. And so we all agreed that that was a great thing, that we're gonna petition the court and we're gonna get this revised. When I first spoke with David, one of the things I said to David that I have regretted to this day was, David, this is not an unusual situation. We assist people to return to independent living, to live in the community if that is their desire. We do this on a regular basis. There's some paperwork. It's a little bit of a process, but I was pretty confident, telling Dave, hey, you could maybe even be home by Christmas. Oh my, how those words failed David. So in November of 2020, David goes with staff from the facility to Huntington County because, as I said, Mr. Malee's petitioned the court to have a new hearing. And at this hearing, Mr. Malee indicates that he doesn't feel he's an appropriate guardian because he knows that David is eventually returning home to Huntington County. And Mr. Malee felt that it would be better if David had a guardian in Huntington County because that's where David would be living. That's where his home was. That's where Dave wanted to be. So at this hearing in November of 2021, Judge Zanuck at that point provides temporary guardianship to the Huntington County Area Agency on Aging. And it was very interesting because this is when things began to sour greatly. As I said, prior to for the sake of acronyms, I'm going to use the term the AAA. It had nothing to do with the automotive club, folks, but referring to the Agency on Aging. So the AAA immediately contacted our CEO at our facility, Misty Dion, and informed Misty that they were the guardians and that, we really didn't need to interfere. We had explained on several occasions, David had explained to his social worker and to the facility administrator, Ms. Thompson, that he wanted to return home to Huntington County and he wanted to have home and community-based services. This did not please the facility. There were times when Ms. Thompson, she called the facility, asked to speak to my supervisor, basically said to my supervisor, look, you've got to get somebody else in here. Karen's difficult to work with. She's demanding. Basically it was like kind of call your dogs off. Misty explained to Ms. Thompson that Misty had no other advocate to send and that she would talk to Karen. She would talk to me about my approach and we would go forward from there. Meanwhile, David is very concerned about conversations with the facility staff. David doesn't trust the social worker. He does not trust the administrator, and he is not very comfortable with the information he is being given by his court-appointed attorney, a gentleman named Mr. Ray Gaynor from Huntington County. David called one day and he was very panicky and he said, look, I have to have this meeting. He said, and it's going to be via Zoom. Now, keep in mind, folks, like I said, this is 2020 and the pandemic is raging through nursing homes. So there's no direct contact. David knew nothing about what a Zoom meeting was. I explained to David what it was, that it was a virtual meeting. And David asked if I could please join him, myself or another advocate from Roads to Freedom, because he was just suspicious of conversations he had previously had with the facility staff and social worker. So I contacted the social worker and I made that request, and David reiterated that request and said, yes, please share the link with Roads to Freedom so that I can have an additional person on my side for this call. We were told that the link would be shared, and about 3 hours later, the day of the meeting, David called and he was very upset because there was no one from Roads to Freedom there to advocate for him, to give him some support. We explained to David that no one ever gave us the link, that we had no way of accessing the meeting because the facility did not share the information. And what went on from there, folks, is gradually just, a downward spiral for David's civil rights. We had a facility who was forbidding us to visit him. We had contacted staff that worked at the facility and knew that they were using a chat box to allow other residents to have guests, to meet with families, friends, and advocates. So we began reaching out for support. Our initial contact was with the Lycoming County Ombudsman's office and contacted the ombudsman and explained, hey, David's having a hard time getting an advocate involved. And basically what we were told was there's a guardian involved in this situation. And the Guardian is making the choice that, you know, David doesn't need this additional support. We were determined to offer this service to David because, for one, we're federally funded to provide transition services to people. And for number two, David was continuing to call our facility. It was very difficult to call back to Dave because, again, he's in this facility, he's sharing a room with 3 other people. Sometimes phones weren't available. So conversations and contact with David was very, very challenging. We finally, after working with the ombudsman, explained that David wanted to have guests, others were having guests, please facilitate this. And in October of 2020, we finally got the opportunity to meet David face to face. And one of the things that charmed me the most about David when Misty and I met with him that day, David's concern as we were leaving was, he said, I need a favor. And it's very important. And, you know, and we asked, well, what could we do for you? And he reached inside his jacket and he pulled out his mail-in ballot. He didn't trust the facility to mail in his electoral ballot. So he asked that we would do that. And he also had a journal that he kept. And again, that's where Please Don't Murder Me comes from. And David didn't trust the facility staff. He felt that they might look in his journal. So he asked staff to please take that journal, and at a later time, we would return this journal to him. David gave us verbal permission, and in writing, David indicated his provider of choice to transition would be Roads to Freedom. And there you go, we're gonna move forward, or so we thought. We reached out to David's supports coordinator. David was enrolled in Community Health Choices, and asked the supports coordinator, hey, we'd like to talk to you about putting together a care plan. David would like to do this. We were told, can't talk to you, there's a Guardian. So what continues to happen, folks, is just, again, David's rights being stripped out from under him every opportunity possible. In December of 2020, because again, the pandemic is raging, 70% of the deaths in Pennsylvania occurred in congregate facilities. We felt it would be in David's best interest to get him some kind of communication. So we spoke to David about having a cell phone. David was thrilled at the option to have a cell phone. He wouldn't have to wait in line to get phone calls. He would be able to have greater independence, and he could have access to information. So we made arrangements to take a phone to David. And the day that David got his phone, I was in my office, and my coworker across the hall, a gentleman named Jay was talking to David, and, you know, David received the package, and Jay had put a note in there explaining how to turn the phone on. And within like an hour or an hour and a half, Jay and David are now texting each other. David's picking up on this technology pretty quickly. David was very, very happy. During this conversation with Jay, a social worker came into David's room, and David was having problems getting the windows to close on the cell phone, you know, the app windows. So Jay said to David, well, maybe this person that came in could help you. And he overheard David say, hey, could you show me how to close these windows? So when the social worker saw the phone, saw the device, and she was more than happy to help David, but when she realized that the device had come from the Assistive Technology Resource Center that is operated out of Roads to Freedom, she immediately told David, you cannot have this. She asked David, what else did they give you? Wanted to see the package, looked through the package to see if there were any other contents in it, told David that she wanted the charger, and stole David's personal property. And this was all overheard on the phone. So David called our agency later that day from the landline, and he explained that he went down the hall. He saw his social worker, Alicia, take the phone into the administrator's office. And David's words in his journal described the social worker like a dog taking her kill into her master to be rewarded for it. It was the next day, I believe, that the CEO at Roads to Freedom received a phone call from Ms. Thompson, the facility administrator. Ms. Thompson said that there was a court order for Roads to Freedom to have no contact with Mr. Italiano, that there would be no written communication, no verbal communication, and that we could come and pick up our phone. This did not sit well with David or any of us. And in the meantime, we have been giving David referrals to many, many different places. We provided David with a referral to Disability Rights Pennsylvania. David was working there with an attorney named Rich King. David would tell Rich the same things that he was telling Roads to Freedom. I want to get out of this facility. I want Roads to Freedom help. Meanwhile, David's guardian, the Area Agency on Aging, the AAA, is calling Roads to Freedom and telling us, you are harassing David. David becomes very angry after you call. David does not want any contact with you. So we would immediately reach back out to Disability Rights to confirm, to have them contact David. And lo and behold, what they were saying was not truthful. David did want to continue to work with us. So the hearing in which the AAA was appointed the guardian, at that time, the judge, George Zanuck, he could not determine if David was still competent or not. So he asked for an extension. Meanwhile, David was very concerned. What kind of evidence had the facility used or had his guardian used to show that David needed to have a guardian and that David was incompetent and not capable of making choices? So David immediately went to his social worker. This was on December 1st of 2020. And he asked, as a person with or without a guardian has a right, he asked to see his medical records. David was told not to worry about it. It really didn't matter. And David continued to self-advocate and say, I want this information. So after 2 weeks of asking a social worker to provide him this information, David reached out to me and asked for our assistance. We reached out to the local ombudsman and said, will you please facilitate this? So I'll make the story short, folks. It wasn't until about 8 weeks after David had requested this information. By this time, the judge has ruled. In January of 2021, he says, nope, David is still incompetent. And now the AAA is a permanent guardian. They are not just temporary. They are guardian of David's finances, David's estate, David's body. And David did not have those records that were basically used against him. It wasn't until our CEO, Misty Dion, escalated this to the state office of, to Margaret Barajas. Margaret serves as the state long-term care ombudsman through the area of aging. It was not until it was escalated there that David was given the records that he had requested back in December. Unfortunately, like I said, it was too late. The judge had already ruled. So David is feeling incredibly defeated. Roads to Freedom again tries to assist David with a device, working with an organization called ADAPT, a grassroots advocacy group. 2 members from that group went to the facility in February of 2021 to provide David with a cell phone. And again, we're still not allowed to just come and go from the facility because of the pandemic. So David came out and kind of met staff at the lobby area. David couldn't go outside the building because he had a bracelet on, an ankle bracelet, much like someone that was in prison would have on them to monitor their location. They were that fearful of David leaving. So David couldn't come out of the facility. The advocate from ADAPT got the phone to David. There were facility staff that witnessed the interaction, and they called the state police, and Pennsylvania State Police came to the facility. The 2 ADAPT advocates explained that the facility had stolen David's phone, that a gift had been given to David and they had taken it. The facility then countered and said that this gentleman is under a guardianship and that the guardian forbid contact with us. And again, this court order is mentioned that has yet to be seen, saying that Roads to Freedom is not permitted to have contact with David. And the police officer, as we've seen in guardianship cases, explained that this was not a criminal matter, that this was something civil. So therefore, he had no obligation to respond and would do nothing about it, other than tell the advocates from ADAPT to leave the facility or you will be arrested. So the advocates left, and this was on January 20th, and on February 20th. And that was the last day I heard from David. David called the facility, or called our office that day, left a laugh, a joke, and said that, I think they busted us again. He was appreciative of our attempt to get him the phone, but could not happen. So we again go into this, we're frustrated. So on that Monday, I called David. I called David's room. Again, he's sharing a room with other people. Not one person answers the phone. This goes on for 4 days. I'm getting very concerned because at this point, we've had contact with David daily. We have worked with as many advocacy groups as we could to try and get David some support. We had filed complaints with both state and federal offices of civil rights. We have reached out on several occasions to the Guardian and asked, please help us facilitate this care plan meeting for David. We would be happy to assist with this. The facility responded to us that no, they couldn't do that because there was a conflict of interest. So we asked them to explain this conflict, and they indicated that Roads to Freedom could not help David because they were providing services and that this would just be a conflict. And we explained to them that their services were provided at the state level, that we were we were federally funded to provide this service, and that there was no conflict of interest. Now, I say there was no conflict of interest. There really was, but it wasn't with our service. The AAA, the Area Agency on Aging, okay, so they're David's guardian. They're David's, making medical decisions for David. They're making decisions about David's home. David owned a home, had a couple of vehicles. And they are also the same entity that serves as the ombudsman. So if David complained and said that my rights are really, my rights, I don't have any civil rights. My rights have been stripped from me. Nobody will help me with this. And if Adult Protective Services was contacted, lo and behold, guess who the investigating entity would be? It would be the AAA. So yes, there was clearly a conflict of interest. So David is whisked away from Lycoming County in February of 2021. We found this out, we confirmed it when another individual that lived at this facility that we were actively transitioning made a comment and said, wow, I hope you guys can get me out as quickly as you did David. He was here one day and gone the next. So we continue to try to work with the Guardian. We have frequent calls with the Margaret Barajas, the ombudsman through the state. We have actually a meeting with Secretary Robert Torres of the Office of Aging. And Mr. Torres, I will note, who serves as a guardian himself, said that it really wasn't up to him, that there was a guardian in place and that he couldn't force the guardian to honor David's request to have a care plan meeting, to look at some person-centered planning, and to recognize that David wanted to go home. So in May of 2021, a group of advocates from ADAPT took a trip to Huntington County, and we went to the Area Agency on Aging, and we said, look, we get it. You have the power. You've got the power. You're the guardian. But we've not heard from David in months. Could you please just call him and allow us to hear his voice? We want to know that he's okay. We were told, nope, that is not going to happen. You need to leave. The advocates refused to leave the building, and the local police enforcement were called to come in, and the advocates explained to the police why we were there. And we asked the officers if they could ask the staff at the AAA to please just call David, let this police officer know that David's okay. The Guardian said no, they would not recognize the police officer's request. And again, we were told to leave or we would be charged with trespassing. We did receive letters about a week later telling us, letters from the solicitor for the AAA, that we were never ever to step on any of their premises again, or we would be arrested for trespassing. And back to this conflict of interest thing, I may have failed to mention that Judge George Zanuck, the judge that ruled on David's competency, prior to being appointed judge in Huntington County, served as the solicitor for the Area Agency on Aging for Huntington County. So again, that, smells like conflict in the air. We reached out to the Federal Office of Civil Rights. We filed complaints there. We were told that they could not investigate unless we had a signed release from the individual. We explained that we had no contact with the individual because he had been abducted by his guardian, and therefore we could not provide that information. We continued to reach out and work with some amazing civil rights attorneys, and we contacted the guardian and said, hey, look, we need you to sign this, and we want permission to advocate on David's behalf to file this complaint with the Office of Civil Rights. So the guardian did go contact David, and David agreed and signed the release. So that was shared, and we were hopeful that the civil rights investigation would lead to, indicating that there's abuse going on in Huntington County and that David was in this fraudulent guardianship. We believed that there was Medicaid fraud going on at the facility, that David was not eligible for that stay at the facility. But anyway, David is whisked away. So a few advocates and some staff got together and did a little bit of investigating and determined that David was being housed now in a facility called the Shirley Home. It was a personal care home operated in Huntington County. And in February of this year, staff from the Pennsylvania Council on Independent Living and the CEO from Roads to Freedom traveled to the Shirley Home, and lo and behold, were able to see David. Even though staff were wearing masks, and David had not seen these staff in a year and a half, he immediately recognized them and was just quite blown away that somebody was still out there on his side. David agreed verbally to have a recording made of that conversation that day with staff from Roads to Freedom and the Pennsylvania Council for Independent Living. And David expressed again his desire to return home to the house that he still owned. He wasn't sure if his house had been sold or not. He had had little communication with his attorney, and he wanted our help. We have again reached out to the Guardian, and every single door that we opened, there on the other side, you might as well have had a sign that said David has a guardian leave. There was absolutely no level of cooperation. There was no one willing to say this individual, even though he has a guardian, he still maintains rights in Pennsylvania. Now, guardianship is done differently from state to state. So when I'm talking about things in Pennsylvania, it may not be the same experience in other areas. But David has a right to communicate with people. David had a right to, be involved in his care planning. David had a right to access a phone. When staff met with David at the Shirley Home in February, he was not permitted to meet privately with them. There was someone monitoring the conversation at all times. So that's a little bit about David Italiano, and please don't murder me. So Sierra, if you could advance to the next slide. If there's anybody out there right now who thinks this can't even be possible, how in this day and age could a guardian force an individual into an institution? We have Olmstead legislation that protects those rights. We have the ADA that says that people need to be offered an inclusive environment and the least restrictive environment. So if you could go back one, please, Sierra, what you see on the slide there was a fax that was sent from the Area Agency on Aging to the facility. And folks, basically it reinforces the fact that there is to be no contact with Roads to Freedom, that there would be no contact whatsoever, and that the services that David would be receiving, that David wanted to be receiving, would be provided by the AAA, and any communication should go to his court-appointed attorney, Mr. Ray Gaynor. Next slide, please, Sierra. I will add that the Roads to Freedom staff did reach out to Mr. Gaynor and attempt to talk to Mr. Gaynor. Mr. Gaynor made it very clear that he had never heard of the Center for Independent Living, and became very sarcastic with our CEO and asked her, are you an attorney? As Misty was trying to explain to Mr. Gaynor about home and community-based services, that David could live in the community, and if he even needs services. We had seen nothing indicating that he did need home care, but that if he did, we would be happy to assist David to get enrolled with the independent enrollment broker and get those services out in the community. This did not happen. Mr. Gaynor basically refused to communicate with us. So that's a little bit on David Italiano. And one of the things that was brought to our attention, well, why does David need to have a guardian? That's always my first question when someone says, I have a guardian. Why? Well, what we were told by Mr. Gaynor and by the guardian was that David was ripe for the picking, that they believed that David could easily be influenced by others and potentially be financially exploited. One of the things that is important for people to understand is that that's not a valid reason for a guardian. Guardianship is not a tool that can fix things like somebody eloping from a facility, somebody who has some challenging behavior, somebody who may be destructive, maybe has committed criminal activity, somebody who displays aggression. Having a guardian is not going to cure or fix those things. Maybe somebody makes really bad choices in social relationships. If everybody that ever made a bad choice about a relationship had a guardian, I'd be willing to say that a good part of our country would be under guardianship. Guardianship then is not a solution to somebody who chooses to self-neglect, somebody who maybe doesn't want to take their medication, or somebody who, doesn't necessarily want to follow recommendations that were given to them. And all people, persons with a disability, persons without a disability, we have a right to make bad choices. Next slide, please, Sierra. And Ron, I'm going to hand it over to you, sir.
Thank you, Karen. All I can say is, wow, you did a great job of describing the situation for David. David is obviously not the most egregious, the worst case possible of what happens to people when they have guardians. But let me get into some of my thoughts about what happened with David and what happens around the country and why we're doing what we are doing, which is for the past, I would say, at least a year, probably a year and a half, we've been having weekly meetings on Fridays, and our group keeps expanding. We keep doing strategy. We try to figure out how we can interrupt this confinement of David, this obstruction of his rights. And we're going to keep working on it. He's still incarcerated in a home healthcare facility, which is ridiculous. So let me talk first about who I am and how I got into this and what we're trying to do. As I said before, I'm an elder. I'm older than David. And that means that I potentially, just as everyone that's on this call, could be subject to a guardian. And what does that mean? That means that you will have all your rights taken away from you. A little while ago, I wrote an article for Mad in America. And if you don't know what Mad in America is, look it up on the website. They do a marvelous job combining the stories of professionals and also people who have been incarcerated in some way or another. It could be a psychosocial disability, it could be in prison, it could be what we're doing in terms of guardianship. One of the things in the article I wrote, I started off with a quote from a well-known comedian who said, "You think you have rights. You don't have rights. You have privileges." Rights are supposed to be something that you have that cannot be taken away from you, but they're really privileges that we do have. In terms of my story, I was incarcerated in a psychiatric hospital for 6 months when I was 22 years old. I was diagnosed with schizophrenia, and then I was released after about 7 months. I had shock treatment. I lost my memory. When I recovered 3 years later, I was hospitalized again and diagnosed with schizophrenia chronic type. I was told I'd have to be on drugs for the rest of my life, that I probably wouldn't be able to work and I'd be in and out of hospitals. Not true. 2 years after that second hospitalization, I went on to graduate study and I received my doctorate in psychology. I'm now a licensed psychologist who works on these kinds of issues with rights. Now, one of the things that I did when I was working under contract with the Department of Mental Health in the state of New York, I was the liaison to the State Independent Living Center from the Department of Mental Health. And this was about 15 years ago. And one of the things that was clearly noticeable is that the independent living centers that were in New York at that particular time didn't know how to deal with psychosocial disabilities. really, I had a personal mission that I believe that all disabilities needed to work together in order to attain their rights and have their freedom. So jumping ahead, this is 15 years later, that when COVID struck, there was an opportunity to band together with all disabilities because there was one mission that was really important that we shared, and that was to get people out of institutions into the community. With the proper supports, most people can live in community. So around that time, I was executive director of Mind Freedom International, and we had a program called SHIELD, which I'll explain later, that we worked with Karen and Roads to Freedom on the issue of getting David back into his own home. And this has been probably a year and a half or so that we've been working together and sharing a common charge. And that is to emphasize people's freedoms and what they need, you know, just to sustain that. One of the things I thought of, I'm not really good at following PowerPoints, so you have to allow me to riff off of some different things. And one of the things that Karen's talk reminded me of is a concept that was developed by a psychologist well-known named Martin Seligman, probably about 30 years ago, and it was called learned helplessness. And that applies to what happens when somebody gets a guardian. As long as you have your needs taken care of, you kind of lapse into dependency. Along with that, there is the issue of isolation that happens. Later on in this particular webinar, Karen and I will talk about alternatives to guardianship and what we can actually do. I'll also explain the SHIELD concept, which is what we do, what we have done and continue to do at Mind Freedom to respond to complaints that people have who are institutionalized or forced to take drugs against their will, or they're being monitored and they lose their rights. The SHIELD is something that we do to support people who have been isolated, alone, and don't have any control of their lives. I'm looking at the PowerPoint, and I think we can go on to the next one, please. Thank you. The dignity of risk is a concept that came out of the developmental disability community originally. It's extremely important. Unless a person is allowed the opportunity to fall down, they'll never grow. You know, the idea of protecting people from everything, i.e. guardianship, i.e. institutions, is something that prevents the growth of people. There's something that I think is very applicable. It was written by a sociologist by the name of Edward Hall, and he said, one of the most devastating things that can happen to a person is for them to be prevented from developing the potential that they do have. So the dignity of risk really talks about that issue, and that kind of morphs into the idea of guardianship protection, whether a person is incarcerated. Currently, the United Nations has a program where they're analyzing institutionalization around the world. And I had the opportunity to speak for 3 minutes in one of the fact-finding things. And one of the things I thought about when I spoke was that 90 to 95% of people with psychosocial disabilities are treated the way maybe 5% need to be treated. So one other thing before I ramble on too much is we need to really examine the whole concept of competency. I've been working in the field with people who are considered psychotic, that had no ability to make decisions. And I've always found that people do have the ability to make decisions, regardless of what shape they're in. Personally, I believe a person has to be in a coma, that they don't have some degree of lucidity. There was a psychiatrist named Ed Potival that defined a concept called aisles of clarity, that in the midst of complete disorganization, there's always some aisles of clarity. And in terms of competency, does a person have absolutely no competency, or do they have the ability to choose, let's say, what kind of cereal they have and they want for breakfast? You know, suppose they like Cocoa Puffs and it's not, you know, necessarily a healthy cereal. Should we decide that for them? You can go on to the next slide, please. You want to cover this, Karen, or?
Sure, Ron. Yeah, you know, as we've told this story so many times, and like I said earlier, people just, you know, they'll say, well, wait a minute, this person has a right to, you know, seek a modification, to request a termination, and they have a right to have an attorney. They have a right to a grievance in court. And if the guardianship is limited, you know, there are still some rights that they would maintain. And that also guardians are required to promote self-determination. And the guardians must make the decisions that they believe that person, excuse me, that they believe that person would make for their own best interest. So I've had people say, well, this is just impossible. This really can't happen. And I've tried to explain to people, it's one thing to, like Ron said, is it a right? No, it's a privilege. It's one thing to say you have this right, but if nobody is enforcing these rights, the rights have no value. Next slide, please. In some states, you know, folks, you maintain that right to marry. There are some states where a guardian can say no. You maintain that right to vote. Now, one of the things I find really interesting, if you have property like David had a couple vehicles and David had a home in Huntington County. Guardian, you know, dwelling and guardian, they must choose the least restrictive dwelling. They must notify the court of moves and whether the adult objected. They can't move to a place where restrictions on leaving or having visitors are present. Guardians can't surrender a person's lease without a court order and a notice of a right to object. So what we've seen here is a guardian, a judge, and a court-appointed attorney that all have this conflict of interest, the relationship. And yeah, when that guardian goes in and says, we would like to sell Mr. Italiano's house, it's probably a pretty good odd that the judge is not going to say no. Why would they sell Mr. Italiano's property? In order to pay for his care. Like I said, we're pretty sure that it was Medicaid fraud that was occurring when David was in the long-term care facility. And folks may not realize, but for every dollar, you know, those Medicaid beds, there are beds in these facilities designated for folks receiving that benefit. And for every $1 that the county is putting out for that cost, there is money back from the feds, $2. So there's an incentive for the county to gain some money. And there's a great incentive for the legal entities that are assisting David to exploit him financially. I remember laughing out loud when I read that David was, you know, he could be exploited financially, and that's why he needed a guardian. What would be more accurate was that his guardian was the one that was exploiting him. Next slide, please. So, decision-making. Ron, let me ask you a couple questions. Are you a financial expert? If you had, you know, some serious financial questions, maybe you inherited some money, maybe you have this lump sum of money, would you just go willy-nilly, or would you reach out maybe, Ron, to your friends, maybe someone who's kind of knows more about it than you, and ask for some input? What do you think?
I would do it as long as I wasn't forced to do it with a specific person that I didn't know and I didn't trust, and I hadn't done some investigation and talked to people I knew.
You know, there's this idea when we talk about alternatives to guardianship, one of the things is supportive decision making. And when we look at decisions, I mean, some of these could be pretty big decisions: financial decisions, healthcare, education, career, life plans. Do I get married? Do I relocate? No one, myself, Ron, or any of you out there listening to this or watching this, was born with this innate ability to make choices. You know, kind of going back to what Ron said, we can start small with making choices. What kind of cereal do you want? What color shoes do you want? What color shirt are you going to wear today? That is how a person learns to make choices. And as like Ron said, when you eliminate that opportunity, it's very, very difficult when you have a guardian that says, well, we need to know that they can do this and they can do that, but you're never given that person the opportunity to make a choice. So they have no opportunity to develop those skills, which so many people seem to think are so important, that people always make really, really, really good choices. Next slide, please, Sierra. Supportive.
Let me take this for.
Yeah, please, Ron.
Okay. I remember thinking, as we've been working all along on this issue with David, getting him into his own place, why is this going on? You know, we've had Shield Alert, where we had people calling the different people that were involved, writing letters, calling legislators, calling the people from AAA, no results. We wrote press releases, we didn't get real coverage, and not much coverage that was going on. We were not having the example of Brittany Shields. So, you know, I thought about this, and during the ADAPT protests, I remember thinking and saying, they're just doing it because they can do it. And then some of you know Mike Oxford, and he had said to me, he said they're doing it because they don't want to open the floodgates of advocacy. And I thought about that. Yeah, if we get David out, then maybe it'll be an example that other SILs can work at getting people out, that they can develop the SHIELD program and be able to move people. It's about power. And then I was also thinking how the Biden administration just came out with a proposal of upgrading nursing homes. And I'm thinking, yeah, that's the right way to correct the problem, have better nursing homes. And then I realized that nursing homes had become the darling of Wall Street. They were putting together these groups that would buy stock in nursing homes, and it's big business. So we know, you know, and I think most of the people who are on this call, on this webinar, are people that are informed, or they've been touched by what's happened by being put in an institution themselves, having a family member being put in an institution. And the notion of how bad this is, I was really surprised, because I had been going around to psychiatric hospitals, reviewing them. I saw some awful places during the time I've been working in the field, the deprival of human rights, the abuses, the lack of understanding. And then I saw what was happening in nursing homes and guardianships across the country. It's really, to me, this is so important to everybody. And I think it is us who have had lived experience in some way or another, either on our own or with family members, or with just a friend, or just facing aging, or perhaps, you know, the unexpected auto accident where we might become brain damaged. Yeah. So don't we want, of course we do. We want to be able to make decisions. So, you know, getting to the slide of less restrictive alternatives. Supported decision-making is a good transition, I believe. It's much better than having a guardian. And we can go into, if we have time a little later, what supported decision-making is. But, you know, it's pretty easy to do a Google search and find out about it. Unfortunately, there are only 14 states now that have legislative supported decision-making. Although most states say that we should have an examination, an investigation of the alternatives to guardianship. Guardianship should be the last choice, but it's not. Advanced healthcare directives is an interesting prospect. I worked on psychiatric advanced directives when I was going around to different psychiatric hospitals around 20 years ago when I was working in New York. And I'll give you one example of what's a problem with much of the things that we face. I was giving a talk. We had a pamphlet on psychiatric advanced healthcare directives. And we were going, myself and another colleague were going around to psychiatric hospitals and introducing the concept both to the inpatients, to the staff. And in the middle of one of these talks at St. Lawrence Psychiatric Hospital on the northern tip of New York, one of the people in the audience started waving the pamphlet at us. And it was a large audience. He had it rolled up and he was shaking his fist with the pamphlet. And he was saying, "What are you going to do to me?" And I was a little dumbfounded. I didn't understand it. But what he was saying is, what are you going to do to me if I don't follow this? What consequence is it? Turned out he was a psychiatrist on the back ward of the hospital. At the end of the talk, the hospital administrator came over to me and he said, "I'm really sorry, that he did that, but he has such a tough job. He gets really excited because he works with the most difficult patients on the back ward." And I didn't say anything, but I thought to myself, okay, you put some really emotionally hyperactive psychiatrist who's losing it himself on the back ward to work with the most difficult patients. Anyway, it brought to my attention something that we were dealing with psychiatric advanced directives, and that was there's no obligation to follow it. However, what we decided to do, and I think it can be advantageous to people, and that was a person would do the advanced directives at a time when they could be not adjudicated, but declared competent, that they knew what they were doing. And they could have two people that they picked out that could witness it and attest to the fact that they were competent to do this, the choices they made. Some people were saying it's better if you have an attorney do that or a professional do that. And we ran into difficulties with it also. So one of the things that we suggested to put on the advanced directives would be that you put out preferences at the end of it. For example, if I got excited and I started to feel out of control, or I appeared to be out of control to the staff in the hospital, that it would be good if I could be put in a private room with an unlocked door with some music that I chose that I could listen to, or allow me to walk and pace the hall and carry on and perhaps walk with a friend, whatever seemed to work. Or in the preferences, I've had Haldol in the past and it's made me really a lot worse. And as on the basis of having this particular drug, I developed a dystonic condition, uncontrollable movements of the muscles, some movement disorder. If I need to be put on drugs, these are the drugs that I don't want to take. These are the drugs that seem to be helpful, and I'd like them to be re-examined a couple of weeks or a designated period of time after it started. So PADS, psychiatric advance directives, can be very helpful. The only problem with it is, well, there's a couple of them. One is they're not mandated that that the facility has to follow them. However, it gives you some leverage if you do want to challenge something the facility is doing. One of the problems with psychiatric advanced directives is also the Ulysses, what was called the Ulysses factor. For those of you who know something about Greek mythology, Ulysses, when he was sailing his boat, his ship, and about to approach the sirens that would sing and entrance the people on the ship to head into waters that would be dangerous. He said, you know, tie me to the bow of the ship so I couldn't countermand the orders that I had given before we got into with the sirens. And that relates to psychiatric directives in the sense, once a person makes a psychiatric advance directive, they can change it at any time. So suppose the person decides to change it at a time when they were no longer competent. One of the problems, but they are helpful if it's a facility that really wants to do the right thing. You want to take over power of attorney?
Sure, Ron, thank you. Thank you for sharing and your personal details as well. Yeah, powers of attorney are very, very simple. I've had individuals come and say to me, well, you know, gee, I can't do this. My mom is my power of attorney. Just to clarify, when someone has a power of attorney, what that says is that in the event that I become incapacitated, let's say I'm in an automobile accident today and I'm unconscious, I'm in a coma, that is when that power of attorney would be activated. So you can designate things. I know I have a friend of mine who makes really good choices. The only thing he's not super skilled with is money. So he decided, you know what, it would be a good idea that I designate my father and my brother to be a power of attorney for my finances. So that is very, very simple to do. It doesn't require an attorney. It can be reversed, and you can specify a financial power of attorney. Perhaps it is medical decisions. Perhaps you're not, but the person may not feel comfortable making their own medical choices, or maybe they just don't feel that they have the information to make a choice. So a power of attorney can be used, and it can be a really great tool to avoid guardianship. You know, one of the things when we talk about David was, okay, guardian says he could be financially exploited. And I talked to David and I was like, well, you know something, Dave, you could have something like a representative payee where, okay, you have a person who, you know, Social Security is supportive of this, that they're going to receive David's monies, and Dave's going to have a budget, and they're going to make sure that David's bills are paid, and that, you know, nobody can come in and, you know, sweet talk David into giving up a debit card or, you know, handing over all of his monies. So again, looking at the least restrictive tools to assist a person to be successful in the community, there are so many tools, like I said, that still allow a person to have their rights, still allow a person to make choices, still empower a person to have their own identity, yet those areas where they might need a little support, they have that support. Next slide, please, Sierra. Okay, what the heck is supportive decision-making? We've been talking about it, and we're going to dive a little deeper now. Supportive decision-making, sometimes referred to as SDM, is a series of relationship, practices, arrangements, and agreements of more or less formality and intensity designated to assist an individual with a disability to make and communicate to others decisions about their life. And like we talked earlier, you know, I think we all informally use supportive decision-making. If my car breaks down, I'm going to reach out to somebody who knows about vehicles and talk to them and ask them to help me decide what should I do. Should I replace the transmission? Should I just buy a new car? Supportive decision-making can take many, many forms. It can be very informal. Now, one of the things that Ron had mentioned was 14 states that recognize supportive decision-making. That is a goal that, more states do recognize this. It is often invisible because, again, it doesn't require a lawyer. There's no cost to the individual. It would simply be as simple as saying, you're a friend of mine, you're a family member, you're someone that I trust, that I would like to assist me with making decisions. And then you kind of write that down and who's going to. And ultimately, it is not just to assist to make those decisions. It's not assisting to make the decision, but it's educating. It's making sure that that person who is going to make this choice understands consequences of the choices. I've worked with many folks and I've said to them, I'm not going to make this decision for you. It is up to you, but you need to understand, or it's important that you know that if you choose to do this, if you choose to go to Atlantic City and spend your $800 and then you don't have money to pay your rent, there are going to be consequences of that. So it's making sure that people are able to make an informed decision. That is really a key there. Excuse me. Basically, the person who's making this supportive decision-making plan, they're going to have a community of people that are around them. And, at some point, if they want to change who is a part of their community, they have the right to do so. And it creates tools for people to get, to be able to say no. If I'm a person with a disability and I have somebody who's, coming to me and telling me you need to this or you need to that, or, you can't smoke cigarettes. It's not good for you. I can remember years ago seeing a staff in a group home smoking a cigarette, telling a resident who lived there that you can't smoke. Your doctor says you're not allowed to. So it's, like I said, allowing people to identify supports that work for them. Again, guardianship is costly. Guardianship, as we are seeing across Pennsylvania and across the nation, is horribly difficult to reverse. So supportive decision-making can be a very, very informal tool that can assist that person and allow them to be successful in the community. Next slide, please, Sierra.
We're starting to run close on time. And could you go to the next slide? I want to talk about SHIELD. Okay. I had mentioned SHIELD before. Before I get into SHIELD, let me say that the psychosocial disabilities is the largest disability silo group. I recognize that in a meeting with Justin Dart when he said this is going back some time, where he really identified with people who had psychosocial disabilities and felt if we could ever combine the two groups working together, we have such common areas of interest like rights and personal freedom and proper treatment, that we would be more of a power to be reckoned with. So Mind Freedom SHIELD, this is a flow chart for it. And since I want to leave time to have questions, at least respond to some of the questions that'll be asked, I'm going to just summarize this really quickly. But on the PowerPoint, it's more detailed. What that is at the Office of Mind Freedom, we receive let's say 7 to 8 calls a week about people that feel they're being mistreated in some way or another because they have a psychiatric diagnosis of severe mental illness, and their rights are being overlooked, denied. And what happens is, it might be one example, which is common that we get, is somebody's scheduled for electroshock treatment, which, to put it mildly, is controversial and causes memory losses, and it's just a terrible treatment. And usually it's a family member who says, that they object to it, the person doesn't want it, they're getting worse, and what can we do? So what happens is one of the staff people will talk, investigate in the sense of trying to talk with the person themselves, because it's always central to the individual wanting this to get out, because it's public. What we're going to do in the last part, when there's nothing else that we can do, when we've contacted local advocates, when we've contacted people that we might know from our protection and advocacy, and nothing has changed, then we do what's called a shield alert, where we have about 400 people, maybe a bit more right now, who have signed up to advocate for this person who's looking to have their rights restored, in the sense that they can make a choice, that they don't want a kind of treatment like electroshock or some drug that is making them feel like a zombie. And what the people have signed up to do is to look at the narrative, which is constructed by the person, the family member. It's agreed upon, the story of where they are, why they're getting this treatment, what happened to them. And then there's a list made of the people involved, the psychiatrist who's recommending the shock treatment, the hospital administrator, local legislators, organizations, whoever people can contact. And there'll be a template letter that the person could put out, or a phone call that would be made. And this would be essentially something that's done so that the person isn't isolated, that bringing the complaint out to the light as opposed to being hidden, that you have the person themselves, the patient, has no ability to change anything. They can complain all they want, but bringing this into the community makes it a subject of discussion. Do they really want to do this? And I think with shock treatment, I can think of at least 3 or 4 times where the shock was stopped and they changed the treatment plan due to the amount of pressure that's put out by the community. Unfortunately, with David, we've put out 3 shock alerts. We've contacted people, we've written letters. There's not been really a response. And I've been somewhat surprised, because generally when it's a psychosocial issue, that we have been able to get responses. So I think this is a method that could be adapted to whoever the person is, whether it's Guardian, whether it's a kind of treatment that a person doesn't want. And you might want to flash, Sierra, on the PowerPoints coming up with Shield, because there's a more detailed explanation of it. Can you move it forward? Thank you. And I'm sure anybody who's on the call can get access to this. And it's really not a complicated procedure. The most complicating part is having the narrative of the person's story, what's happening, and having them agree to it, because this is a permanent record. Once something goes out on the internet, it's pretty hard to be removed, if it can be. We did do one anonymously in Connecticut with the help of a public interest lawyer, and it was successful. There was also an article written in the newspaper about it. But interestingly enough, the feedback we got from the person, who was a 20-year-old, and he didn't want to be known in the community as somebody who was in a psychiatric hospital for his future. So we did it anonymously. However, he complained that the staff had threatened him and said that if you continue doing this, we're going to put it out in the community and everybody's going to know that you've been in a mental hospital.
So much for HIPAA, huh, Ron?
Yeah.
I think we've got just like a minute or 2 yet before we get to questions, Ron.
Okay. I'm sure
little
I
things.
left out a lot of information. This is something that my goal, and I think Karen's is, and many of the people on our committees who are working with David, is we want to establish a broad coalition, and we want to start addressing these issues nationally with guardianship. You know, whether you have the money or the status of Brittany Shields, or you're an unknown person, you're subject to the same violations. Brittany did not have the option of consulting another attorney because she didn't know she could. She was prevented from getting married, all sorts of things that are no different than the person who doesn't have money or fame. It's incredibly corrupt system because a lot of people are making money, you know, whether it's from an estate or it's Medicaid. And probably shouldn't say this, but you know, my feelings is it's a boondoggle for third-rate lawyers to find a way to have a career and accumulate wealth.
Exactly. Just a quick update for folks. Some of the other actions that we have taken, our group, in addition to SEER, which is another organization that helps combat fraudulent guardianships, and that's CEAR. We have petitioned, filed amicus briefs with the Pennsylvania State Supreme Court to request that David's status be reviewed. Those were declined. We, like I had mentioned, we had reached out and we had filed civil rights complaints with the federal office. And what we have been told recently is that there will be some technical assistance provided to the guardian. So we're not quite sure exactly what that looks like yet. You know, Ron and I were talking the other day and we said, wow, this would be a really great presentation, Ron, at the end, if we could introduce David to everybody. But unfortunately, we don't have that access to David yet, but we will get there. We will definitely get there. Sierra, are there questions then from folks?
There have been a couple that have been dropped in. I think you've covered this one a bit, but you might want to just go over it one more time. Just what all are the alternatives to guardianship? Like in specifics to David, what options did he have, or that?
Yes,
and
what
was, I guess the least restrictive alternatives is kind of what you were diving into.
Yes, and the least restrictive alternative for David would be to live in his home in the community. And again, if he needed some kind of support to complete activities of daily living, or you know, the services that he was receiving in a long-term care facility, he could enroll in the state waiver program in Community Health Choices and have those in his home. The big problem is that judges are quick to rush to guardianship directly. It appears that not a lot of people are looking at anything that is less invasive. And I encourage folks, you know, if they're not familiar with the Olmstead decision, Google the Olmstead decision. That is a great piece of legislation that says that, you know, you cannot force a person into a restrictive environment if they can be successful and safe in a least restrictive environment. And we are not seeing that. What we would like people to take away from today's presentation are three elements. There's an element where we need to educate a judicial system. You know, as we started working with Ron and Mind Freedom and SEER and other groups, we are now getting calls. I received a letter from a family in Bucks County, Mr. Robert Harper, whose mother, similar experience, was abducted by a AAA, taken out of his home for no valid reason, and forced into an institution where she was essentially euthanized. We shared this story. We had another gentleman from Huntington County reach out to us, talk about his mother, Iva Rausch, a woman who one day the state police and the area agency on aging of Huntington County knocked on his door and said, your mother is coming with us. Well, what do you mean? Well, it was determined that this house is not safe. Now, what is interesting was there had never been any inspection of the house. There had never been anyone from the AAA come to the home to see, is she safe? So judges and people making these legal decisions need to understand that there are less restrictive options out there. Family members of persons with disabilities need to understand I have a coworker who has a teenage son with autism. Had a transition meeting at school. Everybody there, the experts, the professionals, quote unquote, are saying, well, he's 15. You are going to petition for guardianship soon, right? You want to make sure when he turns 18. And they were kind of horrified when she said, why would I want that? It's really easy to get a guardian. To have a guardianship reversed is nearly impossible. So it is everybody's role. If you're working in an independent living community, you're supporting independent living, you work at a SIL, don't take that, hey, there's a guardian, stand back, get away. No, that's not okay. When that's the first thing that you're told is there's a guardian, mind your own business, that should be the first flag that goes up that says something isn't right here and this person's rights are not being recognized.
Okay, and then
let me just add something, Sarah. One of the things, if you look around where you live, if you'll find that elderly people who need assistance generally get assistance, and there are a number of families who don't have guardianship, even though from the time their Down syndrome child is born, they're encouraged to put that person in a guardianship. What we need to do as advocates, we need to develop systems. I think the SILs are ideally, they're ideal for developing systems of support that can work with people that are less restrictive than guardianships. There needs to, these are old and antiquated systems where you put people in these congregate living centers where they get just a complete lack of freedom to make choices. Of course, there are people that need more intense care, but we need to develop systems that don't require, I'm sure, or I would bet that most of the people on this call have seen or been inside institutions, whether they're nursing homes or some kind of group facilities. And we can do much better than that. We're doing the same thing we have done. And SILs are charged with bringing people back into community.
Thank you for that. We had two more questions. One was, what does boondoggle mean? You mentioned it, a boondoggle for a third-rate lawyer.
I don't remember hearing that.
Okay.
But it's basically.
Would it be like
I would assume that you use the word, Karen, because I don't remember.
I think that would be a free-for-all just kind of woohoo, anything goes. Nobody's watching. Nobody cares what I'm going to do. So I'm just going to get and take as much as I can. And
yeah, it's like somebody has thrown baskets of money out the window. Just grab it. You don't need to do anything to get it. It's free money. It's easy.
That's how those attorneys doing guardianship, exactly that.
And there was one more, I think, Ron, this was when you were sharing your story a bit. Can you elaborate on saying, it, quote unquote, incarcerated regarding psychiatric hospitals? And we have like no time left. So if you can
incarceration basically means that you can't leave where you are. The doors are locked. Quickly, I remember I was considered non-compliant, so they wouldn't let me off the ward. And whenever they had the person come in to take people to arts and crafts, basket weaving or whatever, I just wanted to get off, so I'd line up with them, and then they'd see me and they, no, you can't go. That's incarcerated, when you have no ability to get some fresh air or be unmonitored.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing that. I will let you know this has been recorded, and the transcript and the recording will be provided afterwards. The materials that they referenced today, it may have shown bits and pieces of it in the PowerPoint, but the full materials are on our website, and this PowerPoint will be up there as well. We will be emailing all of this information out afterwards. I encourage you to go check it out. there are 3 slides we didn't get to, which have resources, but we purposely did that because we wanted to make sure that y'all had the resources to go. There's state resources that you can plug into your own state, and there's national resources, governmental resources, tons of stuff for you. And then we have Karen and Ron's email up there as well, for you to follow up if you have additional questions. And then there's a step. Karen was so great and put a step-by-step guide for how SILs can be carrying this out. What does this look like from somebody the time that walk into the door to what do you do at every step after that? So I thank you, Karen and Ron, for your time today and all the work that you've put into this and your continued work on this effort. I think, you know, talking about this with NIL, hopefully we can all kind of start be more active in this work. And I encourage, if you want to get more involved, please reach out to them or myself and we can kind of get you connected into some of those national efforts that Ron spoke about earlier. I think both of the interpreters and the cart writer, and thank you for your patience with the little bump with the chat and the captioning today. I'm glad we got it all figured out. And I hope everybody has a good afternoon. Thank you.
Thanks for making this possible, April. April, and as represented by Sierra.
Take care, everybody. Thank you.
Bye.